The Galactic Council had ruled the stars for millennia, a coalition of species that saw themselves as the architects of civilization. They had conquered, subjugated, and absorbed countless worlds into their empire, enforcing order through fear and overwhelming military might. Humanity, to them, was a minor species, primitive, unremarkable, tolerated only because they contributed resources and manpower to the galactic economy. The Council allowed Earth to exist on the fringes, believing humans posed no real threat. They were wrong. General Alexander Graves had once been humanity's sword, the architect of Earth's greatest military victories. A man feared by enemies and revered by soldiers, he had turned the tide of war more times than history cared to count. But war had cost him dearly. After years of bloodshed, he stepped away from the battlefield, choosing instead to serve as Earth's ambassador to the Council, hoping to shape a future where war was no longer necessary. His only real joy in life was his son, Eli, a bright, curious boy who had never known the horrors his father had endured. Graves had shielded him from that world, believing he could give his son a life free from war. That belief shattered the day the Council made its mistake. The conflict had started over resources, as most wars did. A human colony on the edge of Council space had been caught in a territorial dispute with a powerful alien faction. Negotiations had failed, and small skirmishes erupted, the kind the Council usually crushed with ease. But this time, humans fought back harder than expected, and the Council grew impatient. They decided an example had to be made. They sent enforcers, soldiers engineered for war, bred for obedience, and they issued a decree: surrender immediately or face extermination. The colony refused. In retaliation, the Council rounded up civilians, executing them in the streets while broadcasting the event across the galactic network. It was meant to be a warning, a demonstration of power. The message was clear: humanity was weak. Resistance was futile. But then they did something far worse. Among the hostages taken was Eli Graves. He had been visiting the colony with a diplomatic envoy, meant to be under the Council's protection. The enforcers saw no distinction. He was human and he was there. They dragged him before the cameras, a frightened child barely 10 years old, and delivered their sentence. The execution was quick, impersonal, a blaster shot to the chest. He crumpled to the ground, unmoving. The transmission cut off. The universe moved on. When Alexander Graves arrived at the colony, the battle was over. The dead had been counted. The Council had already sent a new governor to oversee the occupation. There was nothing left to fight for. Nothing but the small, lifeless body cradled in his arms. The enforcers who had done the deed stood nearby, watching with indifference, their weapons still stained with the blood of innocents. The ranking officer, a tall, silver-skinned alien with cold, reptilian eyes, stepped forward. "This was necessary," he said. "Your people must understand their place." Graves didn't respond. He simply looked down at his son's face, at the innocence stolen by arrogance. A man who had once commanded legions, who had turned the tide of entire wars, knelt there in silence. And then he stood. The enforcer smirked, mistaking that silence for submission. "This is over," the alien said. Graves met his gaze, and for the first time, the enforcer felt something he had never known: fear. Graves spoke only once. His voice was calm, emotionless, devoid of rage or sorrow. "You have made a mistake." He turned and walked away, leaving the enforcers confused. He left the colony without another word, without a single act of violence. But those who had seen his face that day would remember it for the rest of their lives. Because in that moment, the deadliest man in the galaxy did not grieve. He calculated. The Council received his official protest 2 days later. A formal complaint, filed through diplomatic channels, demanding justice for the murder of a child. They ignored it. To them, it was nothing more than an empty gesture. 3 days later, key Council officials began disappearing. The first was an admiral overseeing operations in the sector where the colony had been attacked. His ship never arrived at its destination. No distress signal was sent. No wreckage was found. He simply ceased to exist. The The second was a high-ranking senator who had voted in favor of the colony's punishment. He was found dead in his private chambers, his security detail unaware of how the assassin had entered. There were no signs of forced entry, no evidence left behind. Only a message, scrawled on the walls in the senator's own blood. "You should have let the boy live." Within a week, whispers spread through the highest levels of the council. More disappearances followed. Generals, governors, anyone connected to the execution of Eli Graves began vanishing without a trace. Their warships found sabotaged, their safe houses compromised. The council's security forces were mobilized, but it made no difference. The attacks were surgical, precise. No alarms triggered. No survivors left to tell the tale. The council convened an emergency session. "This is an act of war," the High Chancellor declared. "The humans are behind this." The assembly erupted in debate. Some called for immediate retaliation against Earth. Others insisted that humanity lacked the capability for such a coordinated assault. The idea that one man could be responsible for the deaths of high-ranking officials across multiple star systems was absurd. It was impossible. But then came the transmission. A live feed interrupted every major council broadcast. The chamber fell silent as the image appeared. A shadowed figure, standing alone in a darkened war room. His face was obscured, but his voice was unmistakable. "Alexander Graves. You took something from me," he said. His tone was measured, controlled, yet laced with something deeper. "Promise. And now, I will take everything from you." The transmission cut off. The council scrambled to track its origin, but it was useless. The message had been bounced through 1,000 relay stations, encrypted beyond their ability to decipher. But it didn't matter. The meaning was clear. Humanity had been underestimated. And now, the deadliest general in the galaxy had nothing left to lose. The council believed in overwhelming force. When faced with resistance, they crushed it. Their fleets spanned the galaxy, their armies numbered in the trillions. They had conquered worlds beyond counting. And in their eyes, humanity was no different. A minor species with delusions of strength. A nuisance to be eradicated. Their mistake was thinking Alexander Graves fought fair. The first real counterstrike was silent. A transport vessel carrying supplies to the Council's forward command vanished mid-flight. Its black box was recovered a day later, drifting in open space. The final recording was brief, static, followed by a single line of audio. "We are coming." 3 more ships disappeared in the next cycle. No wreckage, no distress calls, just ghosts in the void. Panic crept into the Council's ranks. The humans had no fleet capable of this. No technology that could bypass their defenses. Yet their ships were vanishing all the same. By the time the Council realized it was more than simple raids, it was too late. The Ghost Fleet had arrived. For centuries, Earth had hidden its greatest weapon. A fleet that officially didn't exist. Warships designed with stealth technology beyond anything the galaxy had seen. Cloaked signatures, advanced jamming systems, entire capital ships that could slip through enemy territory unseen, undetected, and strike before the enemy even knew they were there. And now they were under Graves' command. He didn't engage the Council's forces head-on. That wasn't how you fought an empire. He cut them apart one piece at a time. Supply lines disrupted. Relay stations destroyed. Key outposts left as nothing but burning wreckage. Council generals woke to find their personal security forces slaughtered in the night. Their bunkers breached without a sound. Entire fleets scrambled to respond to distress calls that had never been sent. The war had begun, and the Council wasn't fighting an army. They were fighting a phantom. The High Chancellor stood before the assembly, voice sharp with barely concealed rage. Enough of this. The orders were clear. Humanity would be made an example. Their fleets would be annihilated. Their homeworld reduced to nothing but ash. If Earth thought it could stand against the Council, it would burn like all the others before it. A fleet was assembled, the largest the Council had ever deployed against a single species. Hundreds of warships, thousands of fighters, Entire legions of enforcers mobilized for planetary invasion. They would strike at the heart of humanity, crush its leaders, and end the threat before it could spread any further. They launched within the hour. They never arrived. The ambush was flawless. The Council's fleet exited warp space at the edge of a dead system. Their navigational systems scrambled. They should have been near Earth. Instead, they were in the middle of nowhere. Then the stars began to disappear. One by one, massive shadows emerged from the void, warships decloaking with predatory precision. Human ships, more than they had ever believed possible. And behind them, something worse. The orbital platforms, hidden beneath the dark side of a barren moon, activating their weapon systems. Gravity bombs detonated in perfect synchronization. The Council fleet's engines flickered, then died. Their ships, so reliant on precise calculations and artificial gravity fields, suddenly found themselves drifting, caught in a well of artificial singularities. Helpless, vulnerable, and then the Ghost fleet opened fire. The slaughter lasted minutes. The Council's mighty warships, built for direct engagements, were helpless against an enemy that moved like shadows. Human strike teams boarded the largest carriers, tearing through command centers, planting explosives in engine cores. The fleet's admirals never had time to react. The few survivors tried to retreat. They couldn't. Their engines were gone, their escape routes severed. One by one, the ships were picked apart, their wreckage left to drift as a silent warning. And then Graves sent a message. Not to the Council, not to the military, to the entire galaxy. The transmission reached every colony, every world under the Council's control. It appeared on personal terminals, on public broadcast stations, on military frequencies. A simple video feed. Alexander Graves stood in the ruined bridge of a Council dreadnought, its once proud banners torn and burning behind him. His face was expressionless, controlled. "You thought you could kill a child and walk away," he said. "You thought humanity would kneel." He stepped aside, revealing the devastation outside. Countless Council warships, broken and lifeless. The remains of what had once been an invincible fleet. "This is your only warning." The feed cut, and the galaxy held its breath. The Council's response was immediate. They declared Graves an enemy of all sentient life. They mobilized every remaining fleet, rallying their forces for a full-scale war. Humanity would not be allowed to rise. But it wasn't just their forces that were crumbling. Their own people were turning against them. The High Chancellor's advisors whispered of defeats too costly to ignore. Some worlds, once loyal to the Council, stopped answering their calls. Even among their own ranks, fear had taken root. Because they all knew the truth. The Council had ruled with fear. They had built their empire on the idea that no one could stand against them. And now, a single man was proving them wrong. The war was no longer about justice. It wasn't about diplomacy. It wasn't even about humanity's survival. It was about revenge. And Alexander Graves would not stop until the Council fell. The Council was unraveling. What had once been an unshakable empire, built on absolute control, was fracturing under the weight of its own arrogance. Entire fleets had vanished, high-ranking officials executed in the dead of night, and their strongest warships had been reduced to drifting wreckage. Fear spread like a plague. Governors who had once ruled with an iron fist now questioned their own security. Military leaders refused to travel without escorts, and even the High Chancellor had retreated to the most fortified station in the core worlds, surrounding himself with legions of enforcers. But no amount of walls, no number of soldiers, could stop what was coming. Because this was not a conventional war. It was something far worse. Alexander Graves was not merely fighting the Council. He was dismantling it piece by piece. Every supply line severed, every key installation destroyed, every strategic outpost left in ruins. The Council's might had been built on the belief that they were untouchable, that no force could challenge them. Now that illusion had been shattered. The rebellion began in whispers. Minor colonies that had long suffered under the Council's rule suddenly refused to send their tributes. Mining operations that provided the Council's war machine with vital resources ceased production overnight. In the outer rim, where the Council's grip was weakest, entire star systems declared independence. At first, the High Chancellor dismissed it as minor unrest. But then, their own enforcers started disappearing. Entire regiments stationed on occupied worlds simply stopped responding. Surveillance networks were compromised, blackouts lasting hours at a time. When the Council finally re-established contact, the planets were no longer under their control. No grand battles, no open warfare, just silence, followed by a new order. The Mark of Graves. The Council scrambled to contain the chaos. They tightened security, ordered mass arrests, executed anyone suspected of aiding the insurgency. But it didn't matter. For every rebel they crushed, 10 more took their place. Because now, the galaxy knew a truth that had been buried for too long. The Council could be fought, and it could be defeated. The High Chancellor issued a decree. Graves was to be captured at all costs. Every remaining fleet was ordered to hunt him down. Bounties were placed on anyone suspected of harboring him. Their best assassins, their most advanced warships, their most elite enforcers, all deployed for one singular purpose: to end the man who had defied an empire. They found nothing. Graves had become a ghost, his forces striking and vanishing before they could be countered. Council warships fell into perfectly executed ambushes. Their command centers breached before they even knew they were under attack. High-ranking generals turned up dead in their own bunkers, their security measures bypassed as if they were never there. Every move the Council made, every attempt to outmaneuver him, ended in failure. It wasn't just tactics. It was personal. This wasn't a war for resources, for power, for territory. This was retribution, and Graves was delivering it with ruthless precision. The Council's desperation grew. The High Chancellor called an emergency summit, gathering the last remaining loyal leaders. Fear hung in the air as they argued, voices raised, accusations thrown. Some demanded immediate retaliation, calling for the total annihilation of Earth. Others urged caution, warning that such an act would only embolden the rebellion. Then the alarms sounded. The security systems, the most advanced in the galaxy, failed in an instant. Every lock, every defense, every failsafe rendered useless. The chamber doors slammed shut, sealing the most powerful figures in the Council within their own fortress. A moment of stunned silence. Then the holoscreens flickered to life, and he was there. Alexander Graves stood alone in the center of the transmission, his expression cold, unyielding. The room fell into absolute stillness. "I told you." His voice carried through the chamber, calm and unwavering. "This would not end until you paid the price." The Council erupted into chaos. Some shouted for security, others demanded negotiations. But Graves continued as if he hadn't heard them. "You built your empire on fear, on the belief that no one could stand against you, that no one would dare." His eyes, like twin daggers, locked onto the High Chancellor. "But you were wrong." One by one, the holoscreens shifted, live feeds from across the galaxy. Council strongholds burning, warships crumbling, enforcers laying down their weapons. "The people you ruled no longer fear you," Graves said. "They fear me." The High Chancellor's hands curled into fists. "You think you can win?" he spat. "You think one man can destroy everything we've built?" Graves tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, behind him, the image shifted again, revealing a station, a massive orbital command hub, floating in the heart of the Council's most fortified sector, the nerve center of their entire military network, the station that controlled their fleets, their defenses, their communications. It was already compromised. Explosions erupted along its structure, rippling outward in a chain reaction. The Council leaders watched in horror as their greatest stronghold, the symbol of their absolute power, collapsed in real time. A station thought impenetrable, gone in an instant. "You built an empire on the backs of the weak," Graves said quietly. "Now it crumbles beneath them." The High Chancellor's face twisted in rage, but there was something else in his eyes now. He understood. This wasn't a battle. This was the end. The screens flickered once, then shut off. The chamber doors unlocked. And the war was no longer a war. It was a reckoning. The Council had ruled for centuries, their grip tightening around the galaxy like an iron fist. They had crushed rebellions, silenced dissent, erased entire civilizations from history. They had believed themselves eternal. But even empires bled. Alexander Graves had not just broken them, he had hollowed them out. Their fleets were decimated, their armies scattered, their leaders cowering in fortified bunkers, waiting for the inevitable. The galaxy no longer feared the Council. They feared him. Yet the war was not over. The High Chancellor refused to surrender. Even as planets turned against him, as his own commanders abandoned their posts, as his most trusted enforcers vanished one by one, he clung to power with the desperation of a drowning man. He still controlled the core worlds, still commanded the last remnants of the Council's forces. And he would burn the galaxy to keep them. Graves knew it would end here. The Council's last stronghold, Prime Bastion. A fortress world surrounded by defense stations, planetary shields, and the shattered remnants of what was once the most powerful fleet in existence. No rebellion had ever reached it. No enemy had ever breached its walls. But Graves was not coming as an invader. He was coming as executioner. The assault began without warning. The Council's final fleet, still reeling from loss after loss, scrambled to respond. Their formations were fractured, their morale shattered. They had been trained to fight wars of overwhelming force. They had never faced a battle where they were the ones outmatched. Ghost fleet warships slipped through their defenses, their weapons carving through hulls with surgical precision. Stealth bombers bypassed automated turrets, striking at critical infrastructure. The Council's admirals screamed for reinforcements that no longer existed. Then the ground assault began. Rebel forces, once slaves, once conquered peoples, once soldiers forced to serve, now free, now vengeful, poured into the capital. They fought not for conquest, not for glory, but for justice. Graves led them personally. He moved like a force of nature, unstoppable, relentless. Every corridor he walked was claimed. Enforcers, once the Council's most feared soldiers, fell before him without a sound. The walls of Prime Bastion ran red, not with war, but with judgment. The High Chancellor had nowhere left to run. He had once stood before the galaxy as its ruler, his will unchallenged, his power absolute. Now he stood in the ruins of his throne room, his guards dead around him, his empire ashes at his feet. And Graves stood before him. For the first time in his life, the High Chancellor felt fear. "You should have left us alone," Graves said. His voice was quiet, steady. "You should have let my son live." The High Chancellor reached for a weapon. He didn't even get close. A single shot. The war was over. The transmission was sent within the hour. To every world, every system, every species that had once lived under the Council's rule. They saw the shattered remains of Prime Bastion, the burning banners, the lifeless body of the High Chancellor. And they saw him, Alexander Graves, the man who had done the impossible, the man who had ended the Council. He did not call himself a conqueror. He did not claim a throne. He simply stood in the ruins of what had once been absolute power and said 4 words. "You are all free." The galaxy did not celebrate. It did not erupt in cheers or grand speeches. It simply stood still, as if unable to process what had happened. And then, slowly, a new dawn began. Worlds rebuilt. Alliances formed. The scars of the past would never fully fade. But for the first time in centuries, the future was theirs to decide. As for Graves, he did not stay to see it. By the time the first new government formed, he was gone. No one knew where. Some said he had returned to Earth, to mourn in silence. Others believed he had vanished into the void, waiting in the shadows should tyranny ever rise again. But the galaxy remembered, not just the man, but the lesson. Empires fall, and even the most powerful can bleed.